a forbidden kiss between a Japanese POW woman and a black soldier, in a time when such feelings meant danger for them both. The year is 1944. Barbed wire cuts across the Oregon coast. Guards patrol with fingers on triggers. A wounded nurse collapses in the rain. A soldier defies orders to carry her to safety. What begins as a simple act of mercy grows into something neither of them expected. Something the whole camp watches with bated breath. Their eyes meet across a fence that separates two worlds. Their hands touch over medicine bottles and prayer books. Letters pass in secret. Then on Christmas Eve, beneath falling snow, they risk everything for a single moment. The kiss that makes the whole camp fall silent. But war has other plans. Separation, battlefields, shrapnel, and scars. What happens when duty to country clashes with the heart's deepest truth? Can love survive when the whole world stands against it? Rain lashed against the wooden guard tower of Crescent Bay POW camp. The Oregon coast was known for its wild October storms, but this one seemed angrier than most. Private Elijah Brooks pulled his army coat tighter around his tall frame and wiped water from his eyes. The night watch was always lonely, but tonight the howling wind made it worse. 3 more hours, he muttered to himself, checking his pocket watch by flashlight. Lightning cracked across the sky, lighting up the barbed wire fence that surrounded the camp. For a brief moment, Elijah could see the whole compound. The prisoner barracks, the infirmary, the mess hall, all dark except for a few dim lights. Behind the camp, the angry Pacific Ocean crashed against the cliffs. Elijah was tired. He'd been assigned double shifts again this week. Being one of the few black soldiers at camp meant extra duties nobody else wanted. The white officers made sure of that. "Brooks, you sleeping up there?" Sergeant Willard Haskins shouted from below. "No, sir," Elijah called back, standing straighter. "Just keeping watch." "Well, watch harder," Haskins sneered. "Can't have any Japs escaping on your watch." Elijah bit his tongue, a skill he'd mastered growing up in Georgia. He joined the army hoping to serve his country with pride, but even in uniform, the same old treatment followed him. He scanned the perimeter again, rain dripping from his helmet. That's when he heard it, a faint cry carried on the wind. At first, he thought it might be a seagull or his imagination, but there it was again. Elijah grabbed his flashlight and pointed it toward the sound. Near the fence, a small figure was struggling through the mud. He climbed down the tower ladder quickly and splashed through puddles toward the fence. As he got closer, he realized it was a woman. Her dark hair was plastered to her face, and her clothes were soaked through. She was trying to walk, but kept slipping in the mud. "Ma'am?" Elijah called out, approaching carefully. "Are you all right?" The woman looked up, startled. Her face was pale in the flashlight beam. She was Japanese, one of the civilian nurses assigned to the camp infirmary. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. "Prisoner, very sick. I was getting medicine." As she spoke, her legs gave way beneath her. Elijah rushed forward, catching her before she hit the ground. She felt small and fragile in his arms, shivering from the cold. Military rules were clear: minimum contact with prisoners or Japanese personnel. But looking at the woman's pale face, Elijah couldn't just leave her there. "I'll get you to the infirmary," he said, lifting her into his arms. Through the pounding rain, Elijah carried the woman across the muddy yard. Her eyes fluttered open once, looking up at him with confusion and gratitude before closing again. The rain washed over them both as he walked toward the faint light of the infirmary. He knew he was breaking rules, but something deeper told him it was the right thing to do. Morning came with a drizzling rain that tapped gently on the infirmary roof. Aiko Tanaka lay on a narrow cot, her breathing steady now. Dr. Miller had said she'd caught pneumonia from being out in the storm. Outside, sitting on the infirmary steps with his back against the wall, Elijah waited. His uniform was still damp, his boots caked with dried mud. He hadn't gone back to his barracks yet. Something made him want to make sure the nurse was okay. Heavy footsteps splashed through puddles, and Elijah looked up to see Sergeant Haskins approaching, his face like a thundercloud. "Brooks, what in God's name were you thinking?" Haskins loomed over him. "You touched one of them, carried her like she was some kind of princess?" Elijah stood, straightening his uniform as best he could. "Sir, she was collapsed in the rain. She's a nurse who helps our men too." "She's the enemy," Haskins spat. "Japanese. Or did you forget Pearl Harbor? My brother died on the Arizona." "With all due respect, sir, she's a civilian nurse," Elijah said quietly. By now, a small crowd of soldiers had gathered, whispering among themselves. Elijah caught snippets of their conversation. "That Jap nurse has bewitched him. Always knew those colored boys couldn't follow orders." Fraternizing with the enemy. Elijah's jaw tightened, but he kept his face calm. He'd heard worse growing up in Georgia. "Is there a problem here, gentlemen?" The deep voice cut through the muttering. Reverend Samuel Grayson, the camp's new chaplain, walked toward them. He was an older man, with kind eyes and gray-streaked hair. Unlike most, he looked at Elijah with respect. "Just explaining to Private Brooks why we don't cozy up to the enemy," Haskins said. Reverend Grayson nodded thoughtfully. "I see. And did Private Brooks explain why he helped the nurse?" "She was sick, collapsed in the rain," Elijah said. "Ah," the chaplain smiled. "Like the Good Samaritan. Jesus told that story, you know. A man beaten, left for dead, ignored by those who should have helped, until someone unexpected showed mercy." Haskins shifted uncomfortably. "This is the Army, Reverend, not Sunday school." "Indeed it is," Grayson agreed. "And in the Army, we value courage, honor, and doing what's right, don't we?" Private Brooks showed all three. Before Haskins could reply, the infirmary door opened, asking about the man who helped her. Elijah looked at Haskins, who gave a disgusted wave of his hand. 5 minutes, Brooks, then report for duty." Inside the infirmary, Aiko lay on a cot near the window. Her dark hair framed a face still pale, but no longer feverish. Her eyes opened as Elijah approached. "You," she whispered, "you saved me." Her English was good, with just a slight accent. "Just did what anyone would do," Elijah said, suddenly feeling awkward. "Not anyone," she replied softly, her eyes meeting his before she drifted back to sleep. The next day, Elijah stood at attention in Major Archer's office. The camp commander was a hard man who believed rules were what kept chaos at bay. His desk was perfectly organized, his uniform spotless. "Private Brooks," Major Archer said, not looking up from the paperwork before him. "You disobeyed standing orders regarding contact with Japanese internees." "Yes, sir," Elijah admitted. "The nurse was sick and—" "I don't recall asking for an explanation, Private," Archer cut him off. "Rules exist for a reason. Break them and discipline falls apart." He finally looked up, his gray eyes cold. "I could have you court-martialed." Elijah stayed at attention, eyes forward. "Yes, sir." A knock at the door interrupted them. Reverend Grayson entered, nodding respectfully to Major Archer. "Pardon the interruption, Major. I heard you were speaking with Private Brooks." "This is a disciplinary matter, Chaplain," Archer said. "Of course." Reverend Grayson sat down uninvited. "But I thought you might like to know that Nurse Tanaka has been instrumental in treating several cases of influenza among our men. Dr. Miller says without her knowledge of natural remedies, we might have lost 2 soldiers last month." Major Archer frowned. "What's your point, Chaplain?" "Simply that Private Brooks's actions, while technically against regulations, saved someone valuable to this camp's well-being." Grayson folded his hands. "Perhaps mercy, in this instance, serves the greater good." Archer leaned back, looking between the chaplain and Elijah. After a long moment, he sighed. "Very well. Instead of court-martial, Private Brooks will be reassigned to guard duty at the infirmary under proper supervision." He pointed a finger at Elijah. "But one more step out of line and you're finished. Understood?" "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." That evening, Elijah sat alone in the small camp chapel. It wasn't much, just a plain room with wooden benches and a cross on the wall. But it was quiet, and Elijah needed that. He opened his worn Bible, turning to the Psalms. His grandmother had taught him to find comfort there when the world seemed too harsh. "The Lord is my shepherd," he read softly. "I shall not want." Across the yard through the chapel window, he could see the infirmary. A figure moved inside, lighting lanterns as evening fell. Iko's slender form was silhouetted against the warm light. Two souls, separated by war, race, and rules, each finding their own kind of peace as night settled over the camp. A week passed, and the October rains finally lifted. Sunlight broke through the clouds, turning the puddles around camp into mirrors reflecting a bright blue sky. Elijah's new assignment had him delivering supplies to the infirmary every day. At first, he'd been nervous, especially with Sergeant Haskins watching his every move. But as days passed, the routine became comfortable. Today, he carried a box of fresh bandages and medicine bottles. Pushing open the infirmary door with his shoulder, he called out, "Delivery from the supply sergeant." Iko appeared from behind a screen wearing a simple dress and white apron. She looked better, still thin but with color in her cheeks again. "Private Brooks," she greeted him with a small bow. "Thank you for bringing supplies." Elijah set the box down on a table. "Just doing my job, ma'am." An awkward silence fell between them. Elijah knew he should leave, but something made him linger. "Do you need help with anything else?" he asked finally. Iko hesitated, then gestured to empty water buckets. "I need fresh water for patients, but—" She touched her chest, indicating she was still weak. "I can get that for you," Elijah offered. "Where's the well?" "Behind building. I will show you." Together they walked to the small well behind the infirmary. Elijah worked the pump, while Iko held the buckets. As water splashed into the first bucket, some of it sprayed up, catching Iko by surprise. She jumped back with a small cry, then laughed, a sound so unexpected and musical that Elijah couldn't help but join in. "Sorry about that," he said, still smiling. "This pump's got a mind of its own." "It is spirited," Iko replied, searching for the right word. "That's a good way to put it," Elijah agreed, filling the second bucket. As they carried the water back, Iko spoke softly. "Thank you for helping me in the storm. I never said properly." "You don't need to thank me," Elijah said. "Anyone would have done the same." Iko shook her head. "No, not everyone sees a person. Some see only enemy." Elijah understood too well what she meant. "My grandmother always said, God don't see uniforms or colors, just hearts." "Your grandmother is wise woman," Iko said. "In my language, thank you is arigato." "Arigato," Elijah repeated, the word feeling strange on his tongue. "Very good," Iko smiled. "And in your language?" "Thank you kindly," Elijah said, with a hint of his Georgia accent. "Thank you kindly," Iko repeated carefully. They reached the infirmary door, and Elijah set the heavy buckets down inside. He knew he should leave, but turned back one last time. "I'll be back tomorrow with more supplies." "I will be here," she replied. That evening, as Elijah walked back to the barracks, Iko stood by the infirmary window. For the first time since coming to this place of fences and rules, she smiled as she watched him go. Sunday brought a break in routine. After morning roll call, the mail truck arrived, and soldiers gathered eagerly. Letters from home were precious things, lifelines to a world beyond barbed wire and military orders. Elijah waited patiently at the back of the crowd. Finally, the mail clerk called, "Brooks, letter for you." The envelope was worn from traveling, addressed in his mother's careful handwriting from Macon, Georgia. Elijah found a quiet spot under a pine tree and carefully opened it. "My dearest son," he read, "the church is praying for you every Sunday. Reverend Wallace asks after you, and Mrs. Johnson's boy came home missing an arm from fighting in Italy. Makes me grateful you're somewhere safer, though I know it can't be easy being so far from home." Elijah smiled at his mother's chatty style, filling pages with news of neighbors, church events, and family updates. Near the end, her words turned more serious. "I hope they're treating you decent out west. I know how hard it can be, wearing that uniform while some folks still see only your skin. But hold your head high, Elijah." You're doing right by your country, even when your country doesn't always do right by you. Keep faith, and remember what your granddaddy always said. The Lord sees true service, even when men don't. Elijah folded the letter, tucking it inside his Bible for safekeeping. His mother understood what it was like here, without him having to explain. Later that afternoon, he had guard duty at the infirmary again. When he arrived, he found Aiko sitting with an elderly Japanese man. She was reading a letter to him in Japanese, her voice gentle. The old man's eyes were closed, but tears ran down his weathered cheeks. Elijah stood quietly by the door, not wanting to interrupt. When she finished, Aiko patted the old man's hand and stood up. His son, she explained quietly to Elijah, writes from another camp. Very sick. That's tough, Elijah said. Must be hard being separated. Aiko nodded, many families broken by war. She looked at the letter in her hands. You received letter today too? I saw mail truck. From my mother, Elijah said. Back in Georgia. Georgia, Aiko repeated. Is far from here? About as far as you can get and still be in America, Elijah said. 3,000 miles, give or take. Your family must miss you very much. Yeah, they do. Elijah hesitated, then asked, What about your family? Where are they? A shadow crossed Aiko's face. Some in Japan, some in camps like this. My father was teacher in San Francisco before war. I'm sorry, Elijah said, meaning it. War changes everything, Aiko said simply. Then, with a small smile, Your mother? What does she say in letter? Church gossip mostly, Elijah chuckled, and prayers for better treatment out west. She knows? Mothers always know, Elijah said, even when you don't tell them. They shared a look of understanding. Different as their lives had been, some things were the same across all borders. That night, Elijah sat on his bunk, writing by flashlight. Dear Mama, he began, thank you for your letter. Things here are all right. The Oregon coast is nothing like Georgia, wild and rocky, with the biggest waves you've ever seen. He paused, pen hovering over the paper. Then he added, I met a nurse who reminds me what mercy looks like. She helps everyone, enemy or friend, just like you taught me the good Lord expects us to do. By mid-November, the weather had turned crisp but clear. The camp had settled into its routines, and Elijah found his new assignment at the infirmary more rewarding than guard tower duty. Dr. Miller appreciated his help, and even Sergeant Haskins had eased up on his constant watching. One morning, Elijah noticed something strange near the fence. Splashes of red and pink where there should have been only dirt and gravel. Moving closer, he realized they were roses, small but vibrant, growing in a carefully tended patch. Beautiful, aren't they? Elijah turned to find Aiko standing behind him, a small basket in her hands. I didn't know anything could grow here, he said, looking at the flowers. With care, many things grow in unlikely places, Aiko replied. The prisoners planted them, for medicine, and she searched for the word. For spirit. For spirit, Elijah repeated, understanding. Even in a place surrounded by barbed wire, beauty found a way. I collect petals for medicine, Aiko explained, kneeling by the flowers. Rose tea helps with sleep and sadness. Elijah knelt beside her. My grandmother used to make rose hip tea in winter, said it kept colds away. Your grandmother and my grandmother would be friends, Aiko smiled, carefully gathering petals. Without thinking, Elijah reached out to help, their hands brushing against each other. For a moment, neither moved away. Then Aiko gently withdrew her hand, looking around nervously. We should be careful, she whispered. People watch. She was right. Across the yard, 2 guards were looking their way, talking in low voices. Don't mind them, Elijah said, though he knew better. Rumors traveled fast at a place like this. It is dangerous, Aiko said softly. For you, especially. I hear what they say. What do they say? Elijah asked, though he already knew. Aiko looked down. That you favor enemy, that it is not proper. Some people think nothing I do is proper, Elijah said, a touch of bitterness in his voice. We are both strangers here. Aiko said simply. They continued gathering rose petals in silence, each lost in thought. When the basket was full, Aiko stood. "Thank you for help," she said formally, as if remembering they were supposed to be nurse and guard, not friends. "Anytime," Elijah replied, watching her walk back to the infirmary. That evening, as the sun set behind the Pacific, turning the sky to fire, Aiko sat alone in the small room she shared with two other Japanese nurses. From her pocket, she took a single rose petal, pressed it between the pages of her small diary. Her hand trembled, and she wasn't sure why. She only knew that when the tall soldier with kind eyes looked at her, she felt less alone in this strange country that was supposed to be her home, but had turned into her prison. Outside, the wind carried whispers across the camp, of rules broken, of lines crossed, of something unholy growing where it shouldn't. Inside the barracks, Elijah read his Bible by flashlight, trying not to hear the muttered comments from other bunks. His finger traced the words, "Love thy neighbor as thyself." Simple words, hard to live by in a world at war. 2 weeks passed at Crescent Bay POW camp. November brought colder winds off the Pacific, and everyone pulled their coats tighter against the chill. For Elijah, the days fell into a rhythm. Guard duty, chapel visits with Reverend Grayson, and quiet moments helping Aiko in the infirmary. But peace never lasts long in wartime. "Attention!" Sergeant Haskins barked one morning as soldiers scrambled into formation. "Major Wallace from Army Intelligence arrives today for inspection. Everything must be perfect." A ripple of tension moved through the ranks. Inspections meant trouble, especially from intelligence officers who were always looking for security problems. By noon, a shiny black car pulled through the main gate. Major Wallace stepped out, tall and thin, with cold eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Unlike the other officers, his uniform was pressed so crisp it might cut someone. "Major Archer," Wallace said, not bothering to return the camp commander's salute. "I'm here to evaluate security concerns. There have been reports of irregularities." "Irregularities, sir?" Archer asked. "Fraternization, lax enforcement, questionable loyalties." Wallace's gaze swept across the yard, "especially among your colored troops and the Japanese personnel." Elijah, standing guard nearby, felt the major's words like a physical blow. He kept his eyes forward, face blank, the way he'd learned growing up in the South. The inspection began with Wallace examining every building, checking records, and questioning guards. When he reached the infirmary, Elijah was helping Aiko move a heavy crate of supplies. "What's going on here?" Wallace demanded. "Just moving supplies, sir," Elijah answered, standing at attention. Wallace looked between them, his eyes narrowing. "Private, aren't there regulations about unnecessary contact with enemy aliens?" "Yes, sir. I was assigned to infirmary security duty by Major Archer, sir." "And that requires you to carry boxes for this woman?" Wallace wrote something in his notebook. "The nurse is recovering from pneumonia, sir," Elijah explained. "Dr. Miller asked me to help with heavy lifting." Wallace stepped closer to Aiko. Where did you learn English?" "School in San Francisco, sir," Aiko replied, eyes downcast. "I was born in California." "Yet your loyalty is to the Emperor, I assume?" Wallace's voice was ice. "My loyalty is to healing sick people, sir," Aiko said quietly. For a brief moment, Aiko glanced at Elijah. It was just a second, but Wallace caught it. "Interesting," he murmured, writing again in his notebook. "Very interesting indeed." After Wallace left the infirmary, the air felt heavy, like the forest storm. Elijah and Aiko worked in silence, both knowing something had changed. That night, as Elijah left the chapel, Reverend Grayson pulled him aside. "Walk with me, son," the chaplain said. They moved toward the edge of the yard, where the wind from the sea covered their conversation. "That officer, Major Wallace, he's writing reports about you," Grayson said. Elijah's stomach tightened. "Because I helped the nurse?" "Because he sees something he doesn't understand," Grayson replied. "Compassion looks suspicious to men like him." "What should I do, Reverend?" Elijah asked. Grayson sighed, looking toward the dark ocean. "Pray careful, son. The Lord's watching." He looked back at the main office where Wallace's light still burned. And so is the army. Dawn broke gray and cold across Crescent Bay. Elijah woke to the sound of trucks, big army transport vehicles rumbling through the main gate. Something was happening. At breakfast, the mess hall buzzed with rumors. "Heard they're moving some of the Japs inland," said Private Johnson, between bites of powdered eggs. "Good riddance," muttered another soldier. "Keep 'em away from the coast in case of invasion." Elijah said nothing, but worry gnawed at him. Then the camp loudspeaker crackled to life. "Attention, all personnel," came Major Archer's voice. "By order of Western Defense Command, all non-essential Japanese civilian personnel are to be transferred to Tule Lake Relocation Center. Effective immediately. Preparations will begin at 0900 hours. The mess hall erupted in conversation, but Elijah heard nothing through the roaring in his ears. Tule Lake was a harsh camp, much worse than Crescent Bay. Without thinking, he stood and walked out, heading straight for Major Archer's office. He knocked on the door, heart pounding. "Enter," Archer called. Inside, Major Archer sat behind his desk. Wallace stood by the window, watching the trucks being unloaded. "Private Brooks," Archer frowned. "I don't recall sending for you." "No." "Sir," Elijah said, standing at attention, "I wanted to speak about the transfer order, sir." Wallace turned, eyebrow raised. "And why would a private have any input on command decisions?" Elijah swallowed hard. "Sir, Nurse Tanaka is the only trained medical professional who speaks both English and Japanese. She's essential to the infirmary operation." "Is that Dr. Miller's assessment, or yours, Private?" Wallace asked coolly. "Dr. Miller relies on her, sir. Ask him yourself." Archer leaned forward. "Brooks, this isn't your concern. You're dismissed." "Sir, with all due respect." "Dismissed, Private." Archer's voice cracked like a whip. Elijah had no choice but to salute and leave. Outside, he stood for a moment, fists clenched at his sides. He had never felt so helpless. In the chapel, Reverend Grayson found him sitting with his head bowed. "I heard you spoke up," the chaplain said, sitting beside him. "For all the good it did," Elijah replied bitterly. "Standing for what's right is never wasted, even when it seems to fail." Grayson placed a hand on Elijah's shoulder. "The Lord sees the heart behind the action." "They're sending her to Tule Lake, Reverend. It's a hard place, cold, bitter, and she's still weak from being sick." "Faith finds a way, son. Sometimes not the way we expect." Elijah shook his head. "It just burns inside, knowing I can't do anything to help." By afternoon, the Japanese civilian staff were gathering their few belongings. Armed guards stood by the transport trucks. Elijah was assigned perimeter patrol, far from the loading area. Wallace's doing, no doubt. But as he walked the fence line, a small figure approached from the other side. Aiko stood there, a bundle clutched to her chest, her face pale but composed. "I heard you spoke for me," she said softly. "Thank you." "It didn't help," Elijah said, aching to reach across the fence. "I'm sorry." "No," Aiko shook her head. "You tried. Few would." From the yard came shouts for the transferees to assemble. "I have to go," Aiko whispered. "Aiko," Elijah began, not knowing what to say. She pressed her hand against the fence, almost but not quite touching his. "I will remember your kindness, Elijah Brooks." The wind seemed to catch her words, carrying them across the yard. For a moment, every sound in the camp stopped. The rattling of truck engines, the calls of guards, even the crash of waves against the cliffs. The whole camp fell still, as if holding its breath. Then Aiko turned and walked toward the waiting trucks, her small figure straight and dignified, despite the armed guards and barbed wire. Elijah stood watching until the trucks drove away, taking with them something he hadn't known was his to lose. Days after Aiko's transfer, the camp seemed emptier somehow. Elijah went through his duties like a man sleepwalking. Even being reassigned back to the guard tower didn't bother him. Nothing much did. One evening, seeking quiet, Elijah went to the chapel. No service was scheduled, so he sat alone, staring at the simple wooden cross on the wall. He picked up a hymn book from the bench beside him, opening it without really looking. A piece of paper fell into his lap, folded small and tucked between the pages. Curious, he unfolded it. The handwriting was neat, but slightly foreign, the letters carefully formed. "Private Brooks," it began. "I hope this finds you. Reverend Grayson kindly agreed to deliver it. We arrived safely at New Camp. It is not as bad as feared. There is work in hospital here too. I think of Oregon Sea often. The sound of waves is like a prayer, constant, eternal, like faith." It was signed simply A.T. Elijah read it 3 times, his heart pounding. Iko had found a way to write to him, and Reverend Grayson had helped. Looking up, he saw the chaplain standing in the doorway, watching him with gentle eyes. "She asked me before she left," Grayson explained. "Said she wanted to thank you properly." "This could get you in trouble, Reverend," Elijah said. Grayson shrugged. "Christ didn't come to make us safe, son. He came to make us brave." He sat down beside Elijah. "If you want to write back, I have ways of getting letters to Tule Lake." Elijah looked down at the letter, then back at the chaplain. "Why would you help us?" "Because I've seen too much hate in this war," Grayson said simply. "A little kindness, a little connection, that's how we remember we're human." That night, Elijah wrote by candlelight, choosing his words carefully. "Miss Tanaka," he began formally, then crossed it out. "Iko," he tried again. "Thank you for your letter. It brought sunshine to a gray day. The sea is still here, still singing its old songs. I listen during night watch and wonder if you can hear it too, even so far inland. Reverend Grayson has been teaching me new scripture verses. My favorite is from Psalms. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. It helps when things seem dark." He signed it, "Your friend Elijah," then folded it carefully and tucked it into his Bible. The next morning, he slipped the letter to Reverend Grayson after breakfast. A week later, another note appeared in the hymn book, and so began their quiet correspondence, words traveling between barbed wire camps, carried by a chaplain who believed love outranked war. "The children here teach me songs," Iko wrote in one letter. "American songs they learned in school before war. My country, 'tis of thee. It makes me wonder, can a country be ours even when it locks us away? My grandmother was born a slave," Elijah wrote back, "but she loved America fierce, said it was a promise not yet kept but worth fighting for. I reckon she was right." Through winter storms and cold nights, their letters kept coming. Small glimpses of daily life, shared memories, Bible verses that gave comfort. Never anything that could be called romantic. They were both too careful for that. But between the lines bloomed something neither dared to name. "Your words keep me steady as an anchor in this storm," Elijah wrote as December's winds howled outside the barracks. December brought storms that rattled windows and sent waves crashing higher up the cliffs. One morning, Elijah was surprised to see a familiar figure stepping off a Red Cross truck. Iko, wrapped in a coat too big for her small frame, was back at Crescent Bay. Elijah had to stop himself from running to her. Instead, he watched as she was escorted to the infirmary. Later, he heard that flu had spread through camp, and Dr. Miller had requested her return to help with the sick. That afternoon, on his way to guard duty, Elijah found the infirmary in chaos. Cots filled every space, with soldiers moaning and shivering under thin blankets. Dr. Miller looked exhausted, and the stove in the corner had gone cold. "Brooks," Dr. Miller called. "The damn stove's broken. We need heat in here or we'll lose men." "I'll fix it, sir," Elijah said, already rolling up his sleeves. He knelt by the old iron stove, examining it. The flue was clogged and the door hinge broken. As he worked to repair it, he felt someone kneel beside him. "You need clean cloth," Iko said, handing him a rag. She looked thinner than before, but her eyes were bright. "You're back," Elijah said softly, so only she could hear. Dr. Miller asked Red Cross, they agreed. She helped him clean soot from the flue. I did not expect to see Oregon again." Their hands worked together in the cramped space behind the stove, neither mentioning the letters they'd exchanged. Some things were too precious to speak of openly. As Elijah fixed the door hinge, Aiko moved away to tend a wounded bird she kept in a small box by the window. "Found him with broken wing," she explained when she saw Elijah watching. "He will fly again soon." Elijah watched her gentle hands splint the tiny wing. "You're good at healing broken things." "All living things deserve care," she said simply. With the stove finally working, warmth spread through the infirmary. As evening approached, patients settled more comfortably. In a quiet moment, Elijah and Aiko found themselves alone by the supply cabinet. "I wanted to be a preacher," Elijah said suddenly, surprising himself with the admission. "Before the war. Had plans to study at a church college back home." "You would be good preacher," Aiko said. "You have kind heart." "What about you?" he asked. "What did you want to be before all this?" "Teacher," she replied, a small smile touching her lips. "Like my father, I was studying at university when war came." "You still can be," Elijah said, "when this is all over." "After war," Aiko nodded. "Many things will be possible then." Outside, snow began to fall, soft white flakes drifting past the window. They stood watching it together, shoulders almost touching. Two people sharing dreams that war had interrupted but not destroyed. For that moment, the infirmary seemed to exist outside of time, a small, warm space where neither race nor war could reach. "A Christmas service?" Elijah asked, helping Reverend Grayson arrange benches in the chapel. "For everyone, soldiers and prisoners alike," Grayson nodded. "Major Archer approved it, though Major Wallace wasn't happy." "I bet he wasn't," Elijah said. Wallace had stayed on at camp, supposedly to monitor security, but really, Elijah suspected, to look for rule breakers. "I'd like you to lead the choir," Grayson said. "I hear you've got a fine singing voice." "Me? But sir, No excuses, Private. God gave you that voice for praising him, not hiding it." So it was that Elijah found himself leading practice sessions each evening, teaching soldiers simple carols. Some were reluctant at first, especially the white soldiers from the South, but music had a way of breaking barriers. Across the camp, Aiko and the other Japanese women were allowed to make paper lanterns for the Christmas Eve service. Red Cross regulations permitted such activities for morale. Even Major Wallace couldn't object. One evening, as Elijah walked back from choir practice, he saw Aiko standing alone in the yard, holding a glowing paper lantern. The soft light illuminated her face as she looked up at the stars. Their eyes met across the yard, the watchlights casting long shadows between them. Something passed between them, a recognition, a connection that needed no words. Later, walking with Reverend Grayson, Elijah spoke without thinking. "She's light in a place that forgot the word." The chaplain glanced at him, understanding in his eyes. "Be careful with that light, son. Some would try to put it out." "I know," Elijah nodded, "but I can't help seeing it." Christmas Eve arrived clear and cold, stars scattered like diamonds across the sky. The chapel was crowded with soldiers and prisoners alike, the space warmed by bodies and candles. Elijah led the small choir in Silent Night, his deep voice carrying the melody while others harmonized. As they sang, he saw Aiko near the back, holding one of the paper lanterns she'd made. Its light seemed to surround her like a halo. "Silent night, holy night, all is calm, all is bright." The simple words filled the chapel, and for a brief time, there was peace in a world at war. After the service, people lingered outside the chapel, reluctant to return to barracks on this holy night. Reverend Grayson spoke with groups of soldiers and prisoners, his Bible tucked under his arm. Elijah had been assigned perimeter patrol, walking the fence line to make sure no one tried to escape during the festivities. It was a quiet duty, and one he didn't mind tonight. The moon was bright, turning the thin layer of snow to silver, and the ocean's voice was a soft rumble against the cliffs. As he rounded the corner near the garden, where the roses had bloomed, now dormant under winter's touch, he saw a figure waiting. Aiko stood by the fence, a lantern in her gloved hands, her breath making small clouds in the cold air. "You should be inside," Elijah said, approaching slowly. "It's freezing out here." "I wanted to thank you," she said, "for the music. It reminded me of home." "Glad you liked it," he replied, suddenly shy. "Your lanterns made the chapel real pretty." Snow began to fall again, soft flakes catching in Aiko's dark hair. "I have one Christmas wish," she said, quietly, looking up at him with eyes that reflected the lantern's glow. "To speak freely, just once, without fear." Elijah glanced around. No one was nearby. The main part of camp was focused on the chapel and mess hall, where coffee and cookies were being served. "I'm listening," he said. "In Japan, we believe all things have spirit. Trees, mountains, even human feelings." Her voice was soft, but clear in the winter night. "I have watched you pray to your God, seen your faith. It is different from mine, but I respect its strength." "Faith keeps me going," Elijah admitted, "when things get hard." "For me too." She looked toward the ocean. "I believe this war will end. Freedom will return. But some days, it is hard to hold on to hope. My grandma used to say, 'Hope's like a candle, burns brightest when it's darkest around.'" "Your grandmother and I would be friends," Aiko smiled. They stood in silence for a moment, snow falling between them, the fence a stark reminder of their separation. "What will you do when war ends?" Aiko asked. "Go home. Maybe finish school like I planned. What about you?" "Rebuild. Find family. Teach, perhaps." She looked down at her lantern. "Remember kindness found in unlikely place." Elijah reached through the fence then, his fingers nearly touching hers where they held the lantern. "I'll remember too." Their eyes met, and something shifted between them. A boundary crossed not by bodies, but by hearts. "Merry Christmas, Elijah Brooks," Aiko whispered. "Merry Christmas, Aiko Tanaka," he replied. Then, with trembling certainty, they both leaned forward. Through the cold links of the fence, their lips met in a gentle kiss, brief, sweet, and absolutely forbidden. The world seemed to stop. Even the snow paused in its falling, hanging suspended in the night air. Somewhere in the distance, the choir began singing again, but here by the fence, there was only silence. The guards on the watchtower turned away, pretending not to see. The prisoners walking back to their barracks froze, then quietly changed direction. For one heartbeat, then another, the whole camp fell utterly silent, a collective holding of breath. Aiko stepped back first, her fingers touching her lips, as if to hold the moment there. "I should go," she whispered. "They will look for me." "Go on," Elijah nodded, knowing the danger for both of them. She turned and walked away, the lantern's light growing smaller as she moved toward the women's quarters. Elijah stood alone in the falling snow, his heart beating like a drum. What had just happened could get him court-martialed, could send her to a worse camp, could ruin everything. Yet as he resumed his patrol, walking the fence line under a sky full of stars, he couldn't bring himself to regret it. Some moments were worth whatever came after. Christmas morning dawned pale and quiet over Crescent Bay. Fresh snow covered the camp like a clean white blanket, hiding the mud and barbed wire for a few peaceful hours. Elijah woke early, his heart pounding as memories of the night before came rushing back. The kiss through the fence, the silent witnesses, the danger they'd put themselves in. As he pulled on his uniform, he heard the other soldiers talking in low voices. "Did you see it? The colored boy and the Jap nurse? Right there by the fence. Bold as brass. Someone ought to report it." Elijah kept his face calm as he laced up his boots, though inside he was churning with worry. Not for himself, but for Aiko. He'd known the risks when he leaned toward that fence, but the consequences for her could be much worse. At breakfast, the mess hall had a strange feel. Some men wouldn't look at him, others stared too hard. Sergeant Haskins walked past his table and muttered, "You're finished, Brooks." Elijah ate his powdered eggs without tasting them, wondering who had already reported what they'd seen. It was only a matter of time. By mid-morning, the answer came. "Brooks, Commander's office, now!" Haskins barked across the yard. When Elijah entered Major Archer's office, he found not only the camp commander, but also Major Wallace, who stood by the window looking like a hawk about to swoop down on a mouse. "Private Brooks," Wallace said, before Archer could speak, "would you like to explain your actions last evening?" Elijah stood at attention, eyes forward. "Sir, don't play dumb, Private," Wallace snapped. "You were observed in an inappropriate interaction with an enemy alien." "Major, with all due respect," Elijah began. "Respect?" Wallace's voice rose. "You disrespect your uniform, your country, and your race with such behavior." Major Archer cleared his throat. "What Major Wallace means, Brooks, is that fraternization with prisoners is strictly forbidden, especially physical contact." "Who reported this?" Elijah asked, though he knew he had no right to know. Wallace stepped closer. "Multiple witnesses saw you at the fence with the Japanese nurse. This crosses every line of military conduct." The door opened then, and Reverend Grayson walked in without knocking. "Gentlemen," he said calmly, "I believe there's been a misunderstanding." "This isn't your concern, Chaplain," Wallace said coldly. "Actually, it is." Grayson stood beside Elijah. "What you're referring to was part of a prayer vigil I organized. Several prisoners and soldiers participated in a moment of silent prayer for peace. It was Christmas Eve, after all." Wallace's eyes narrowed. "That's not what witnesses described." "People see what they expect to see, Major," Grayson replied. "If you'd like to question my conduct of religious services, you're welcome to take it up with the Army Chaplain Corps." For a moment, no one spoke. Then Major Archer sighed. "Wallace, perhaps we should let this drop. It was Christmas, after all, and we have more important matters." "I won't let this drop," Wallace interrupted. "This is exactly the kind of behavior that undermines discipline. I'm adding it to my report." He pointed at Elijah. "And you, Private, are walking a very thin line." After they were dismissed, Elijah and the chaplain walked across the yard together. "Thank you, Reverend," Elijah said quietly, "but you shouldn't have lied for me." "Who says I lied?" Grayson replied with a small smile. "Prayer takes many forms, son. Sometimes it's words, sometimes it's actions, sometimes it's a moment of human connection in a world torn apart by hate." Later that day, Elijah glimpsed Aiko being escorted across the yard by armed guards. She wore the same calm expression she always did, but he could see the tension in her shoulders. Their eyes met briefly across the distance. A guard nudged her forward toward a building near the main office, isolation quarters, where prisoners were held pending transfer. "They're keeping her there until they decide what to do," Reverend Grayson explained, appearing beside Elijah. "Major Wallace wants her sent to a higher security camp." "Because of me," Elijah said, his voice hollow. "Because of fear," Grayson corrected. "Fear does terrible things to men in power." As Aiko disappeared into the building, she turned once and looked back. Her lips moved silently, forming words Elijah couldn't hear but somehow understood. "Do not fear." New Year's week brought melting snow that turned to gray slush around the camp. The holiday spirit faded, replaced by the same dreary routine as before. Elijah was assigned to the guard tower, far from the isolation building where Aiko was held. It was punishment, he knew, but at least he hadn't been court-martialed, yet. Each day he scanned the yard for any sign of her, but she remained inside, a prisoner within the prison camp. Then, 3 days into the new year, everything changed again. "Mail call," the clerk shouted, and soldiers gathered around. "Brooks, orders for you." Elijah took the official envelope with a sense of dread. Inside was a typed notice. "Private Elijah Brooks is hereby reassigned to the 366th Infantry Regiment, effective immediately. Report to Fort Dix, New Jersey, for deployment to European Theater of Operations." His heart sank. The 366th was an all-black combat unit being sent to the front lines. Wallace had found his revenge, getting Elijah sent straight into danger, far from Oregon and Aco. "When do you leave?" Reverend Grayson asked, finding Elijah sitting alone by the barracks later. "Train leaves tomorrow morning," Elijah replied, handing him the orders. "Wallace must have pulled some strings." Grayson read the paper and sighed. "I'm sorry, son. I tried to intervene. But it's all right, Reverend. Maybe it's for the best." Elijah looked toward the isolation building. "At least I can't cause her any more trouble." That night, Elijah packed his few belongings, his Bible, his mother's letters, and the notes from Ico that he'd kept hidden in his hymnal. He'd have to leave those behind. It was too dangerous to carry them into combat. "Reverend," he said, handing the small bundle to Grayson, "would you keep these safe? And if I don't come back, would you tell her I'm sorry for the trouble I caused?" The chaplain took the letters. "You'll tell her yourself when this war is over, but I'll keep them safe until then." As dawn broke the next morning, Elijah stood by the camp gate, duffel bag over his shoulder, waiting for the truck that would take him to the train station. He took one last look at Crescent Bay Camp, the barracks, the chapel, the distant sound of the ocean. So much had changed since he'd first arrived. He'd come as a soldier following orders. He was leaving as a man who'd found something worth more than duty. The truck pulled up, engine rumbling. "Time to go, Brooks," Sergeant Haskins said, almost gently. As Elijah turned to board the truck, Reverend Grayson hurried up, slightly out of breath. "Almost missed you," the chaplain said, pressing a folded piece of paper into Elijah's palm. "She asked me to give you this. Had to call in some favors to get it to her and back." Elijah clutched the paper tightly. "Thank you, Reverend, for everything." "God go with you, son," Grayson said, clasping his shoulder. "Keep faith." The truck pulled away, kicking up slush. As it passed through the main gate, Elijah unfolded the paper. Ico's handwriting flowed across the page. "May the light that found us both in this dark place guide you safely through whatever comes. I will pray each day for your return. The ocean that sings to our shores also touches distant lands. Let its voice remind you, what connects us is stronger than what separates us. With deepest gratitude for your courage and kindness. A." Elijah carefully folded the note and tucked it into his Bible, which he kept in his breast pocket close to his heart. As the train whistle echoed across the Oregon coast, he made a silent promise to return, no matter what it took. The train chugged through the Cascade Mountains, steam rising like ghosts against the winter sky. Elijah sat by the window, watching the tall pines and snow-covered peaks slip past. His journal lay open on his lap, but he'd written only a few lines. Heading east to Fort Dix, then Europe. War seems more real now than it ever did guarding a camp. The journey would take days across the mountains, through the plains, and finally to the East Coast, where a ship waited to carry soldiers to a war-torn Europe. In the segregated train car, Elijah sat with other black soldiers bound for the same fate. Some played cards to pass the time. Others slept or wrote letters. A few talked quietly about what waited across the ocean. "Heard the Germans got machine guns that can cut a man in half," said Private Wilson, a skinny kid from Alabama who looked too young to shave. "My cousin's over there now," replied Corporal Hayes, older and steadier. "Says it's bad, but not as bad as the stories. Says at least the white folks treat you better than back home. They're just grateful for the help." Elijah didn't join the conversation. His thoughts were still back in Oregon, with the sound of waves, the glow of paper lanterns, and eyes that saw him as a man, not just a color. The train stopped in small towns along the way. At each station, the white soldiers could get off to stretch their legs, but the black troops had to stay on board. "Can't have you boys mingling with the locals," the conductor said with a smirk. "Might cause trouble." So they sat and watched through windows as others walked freely on the platforms. "Fighting for freedom we don't even have," muttered Hayes. "Don't that beat all?" 5 days into the journey, as they crossed the Mississippi River, a letter caught up with Elijah, forwarded from camp. It was from Reverend Grayson. "My dear friend," the chaplain wrote, I hope this finds you well on your journey east. I wanted you to know that through what some might call divine intervention and others might call stubbornness, Miss T has been reassigned to a Red Cross hospital in Portland instead of a harsher camp. A small miracle in these difficult times. She continues her healing work there, helping both Americans and Japanese. Her spirit remains unbroken. Keep faith, as she does. The Lord watches over you both. Your friend, Reverend G. Elijah read the letter twice, relief washing through him. At least Aiko was safe, not sent to some harsh desert camp as Wallace had wanted. It was, as Grayson said, a small miracle. That night, as the train rumbled through the darkness of the American heartland, Elijah knelt in the narrow space between seats. Head bowed, he whispered thanks to God for watching over Aiko when he could not. Spring came to France, in patches of green, amid the scars of war. Elijah's unit had been in Europe for 2 months now, serving mainly as stretcher bearers and supply carriers behind the front lines. Even in the army, black soldiers rarely got combat roles, though they faced plenty of danger. The 366th moved through bombed villages and shattered forests, always just behind the fighting, dealing with the wounded and the aftermath. The mud was the worst part. Thick, sucking mud that clung to everything and never seemed to dry. It made the simple act of carrying a wounded man on a stretcher an exhausting challenge. "If I never see mud again, it'll be too soon," said Corporal Darnell Hayes, who had become Elijah's closest friend in the unit. "Amen to that," Elijah agreed, wiping sweat and grime from his face. They were resting briefly after bringing 3 wounded men to the field hospital. Artillery boomed in the distance, a sound they'd all gotten used to, like terrible thunder that never stopped. "Got a letter from my wife yesterday," Hayes said, pulling a worn photo from his pocket, a pretty woman holding a baby. "Little James is walking now. Wish I could see it." "You will," Elijah assured him. "This can't last forever." "What about you, Brooks? Got a girl waiting?" Elijah hesitated. He rarely spoke about Aiko. It was still too precious, too dangerous. "Someone I care about," he said finally. "Back in Oregon." Hayes raised an eyebrow. "Oregon? That's a long way from Georgia." "War takes us to strange places," Elijah replied. "Sometimes you find things you weren't looking for." Before Hayes could ask more, the call came to move out. Their unit was needed closer to the front, where heavy fighting had left many wounded. They moved forward through artillery smoke, the world reduced to gray shadows and deafening noise. Elijah helped lift injured men onto stretchers, Hayes taking the other end. Together, they carried them back to safety, then returned for more. On their 3rd trip, the shelling intensified. Elijah felt the ground shake beneath him as explosions erupted too close for comfort. "We need to move," he shouted to Hayes over the noise. They were halfway back with a wounded lieutenant when the world seemed to explode around them. Elijah felt something hot pass by his face, shrapnel from a shell that had landed just yards away. When he looked over, Hayes was on the ground, the stretcher tipped, blood spreading across his chest. "Medic!" Elijah screamed, though he knew it was probably too late. He knelt beside his friend, pressing his hands over the wound, trying to stop the bleeding. "Brooks," Hayes whispered, his voice barely audible over the continued shelling. "Get my letters. Send them home." "You'll send them yourself," Elijah insisted, though he could see the light fading from his friend's eyes. Hayes gripped his arm with surprising strength. "Promise me, you'll finish the good fight, all the way home, to whoever's waiting." "I promise," Elijah said, his voice breaking. Hayes smiled faintly. "Knew you would." Then his hand fell away, his eyes staring sightless at the smoke-filled sky. That night, after they'd recovered the wounded and the dead, Elijah sat alone in a bombed-out church. The roof was half gone, stars visible through the rafters. He held his Bible, the pages stained with mud and now his friend's blood. Inside were the letters, from his mother, from Reverend Grayson, and the precious note from Aiko. He read her words again, finding comfort in them as shells fell in the distance. "What connects us is stronger than what separates us." Elijah hoped it was true. In this moment, with death all around, it was hard to believe anything was stronger than war's terrible power to tear things apart. But as he sat in the ruined church, he felt something beyond the fear and grief, a quiet certainty that love, even across oceans and barbed wire and battlefields, had its own kind of strength. Shells continued to fall outside, lighting the sky with terrible flashes. Elijah clutched his Bible close, the letters sewn inside its cover, and prayed for strength to keep his promise to Hayes, to finish the good fight and find his way home. Weeks passed in a blur of movement, mud, and gunfire. Elijah's unit pushed forward with the Allied advance, always just behind the front lines, always dealing with the broken aftermath of battle. Summer heat replaced spring rains, bringing dust instead of mud and new kinds of misery. But the fighting continued without rest. One evening in late July, Elijah's squad was helping evacuate a small village that had been caught between American and German forces. Most civilians had fled, but a few remained, too old or too stubborn to leave their homes. "We need to get these people out before the shelling starts again," Lieutenant Porter ordered. "Germans are regrouping just beyond that ridge." Elijah helped an elderly woman into a transport truck, her few belongings bundled in a tattered blanket. She reminded him of his grandmother, the same weathered dignity in her face. "Merci," she said softly, patting his hand. "De rien," Elijah replied, one of the few French phrases he'd learned. As the last truck prepared to leave, the first shells hit. The Germans had decided not to wait for nightfall to begin their counterattack. "Take cover!" someone shouted, and soldiers scattered, diving for ditches and doorways. Elijah ran toward a stone wall, but never made it. A shell landed in the town square, closer than any before. The blast picked him up and threw him like a rag doll. Pain exploded through his left side as he hit the ground. Looking down, he saw blood spreading across his uniform from a jagged piece of metal embedded in his leg. The world began to blur around the edges. Voices shouted, but they seemed far away. The sky above him swirled with smoke and fire. Then darkness took him. Elijah drifted in and out of consciousness. Sometimes he heard voices, medics working, wounded men moaning. Sometimes he saw flashes of light, surgical lamps, daylight through tent flaps. But most of all, he dreamed. He dreamed of the Oregon shore, wild and beautiful, with waves crashing against rocky cliffs. He dreamed of Crescent Bay Camp, but without barbed wire, the buildings bright with sunlight. And he dreamed of Aiko, walking along the water's edge, paper lanterns floating behind her like stars come down to earth. In his dream, she spoke to him, her voice clear despite the ocean's roar. "Mercy is the only weapon that heals," she said. "Not guns, not hate, not fear. Only mercy." The dream shifted, and Reverend Grayson stood beside him in the camp chapel. "The hardest part of faith," the chaplain said, "is believing when you can't see the path ahead. But the path is there, son, always has been." Then Hayes appeared, whole and smiling, no blood on his uniform. "Told you to finish the good fight," he said. "Not much further now." Elijah tried to ask what he meant, but no words would come. The dream faded, replaced by pain and the smell of antiseptic. A nurse leaned over him, adjusting something on his leg. When she saw his eyes open, she smiled. "Welcome back, soldier. You've been out for quite a while." Elijah tried to speak, his throat dry. The nurse gave him water from a metal cup. "Where am I?" he managed finally. "Field hospital near Nancy," she replied. "You took some shrapnel in your leg. Doctor got most of it out, but you'll be heading stateside for proper recovery." "Stateside?" The word seemed unreal. "That's right," the nurse said, changing his bandage. "War's over for you, soldier." Elijah closed his eyes, letting the news sink in. The war was over, for him at least. He was going home. But where was home now? Georgia? Oregon? Or wherever Aiko was? As he drifted back to sleep, the dream returned. The sound of waves, lantern light, and a voice saying, "What connects us is stronger than what separates us." Autumn 1945. The hospital ship rocked gently on the Atlantic swells, carrying hundreds of wounded men back to America. Elijah stood at the rail, watching the horizon, his left leg still stiff from the healing wound. The world had changed while he lay in hospital beds. Germany had surrendered in May. Then, in August, America had dropped terrible new bombs on Japan, ending the war in the Pacific too. Victory. Peace. Words that seemed too big to understand after years of fighting. Beautiful sight, isn't it? A chaplain joined Elijah at the rail, nodding toward where the setting sun turned the ocean to gold. Yes, sir, Elijah agreed. Been dreaming of this ocean for a long time. Going home is its own kind of battle, the chaplain said. Finding your place again after what you've seen. Elijah nodded. He'd been thinking about that a lot lately. His mother wanted him to come back to Georgia, but something pulled him toward the West Coast instead. During his recovery in a San Francisco hospital, he'd managed to send a telegram to Reverend Grayson asking about Crescent Bay, and though he couldn't say it directly, about Iko. The reply had been brief, but enough to kindle hope. Camp now closed. Working at Coastal Mission. Old friends safe. Right when you're back on American soil. The ship docked in New York Harbor on a crisp October morning. The skyline looked like something from another world after the bombed-out villages of Europe. Crowds cheered as wounded men made their way down the gangplank, some walking, others on stretchers. Elijah walked slowly, leaning on a cane, his service medals pinned to his chest. A young reporter took his picture, asking for his name. Private Elijah Brooks, he said, 366th Infantry. Where are you headed now, Private? The reporter asked. Elijah looked west. Oregon, he said, the decision suddenly clear. I've got unfinished business there. It took another week to arrange his discharge papers and transportation. The Army gave him his back pay, a ticket for the train heading west, and best wishes for civilian life. As the train pulled out of the station, Elijah settled into his seat. This time, there was no segregated car. A new law had changed that, at least on military transport. Small steps, he thought, remembering Hayes's words about fighting the good fight. The journey west seemed to take forever. Plains and mountains and rivers passed outside the window as the train chugged steadily toward the Pacific. Elijah's leg ached, especially at night, but each mile brought him closer to what he'd been dreaming of during those dark days in France. In his pocket was Reverend Grayson's address, a place called the Coastal Mission, not far from where Crescent Bay Camp had stood. Whether Iko was still there, whether she would remember him, whether too much had changed, these questions kept him awake as the train rolled through the night. Faith means believing when you can't see the path ahead, he reminded himself, remembering his dream of Grayson. After what seemed like endless days and nights, the train finally reached Portland. From there, Elijah took a bus that wound along the coastal highway, stopping in small towns along the way. Crescent Bay, the driver called finally. Last stop before Newport. Elijah stepped off the bus, his duffel bag over his shoulder, cane in hand. The small town hadn't changed much. A few stores, a diner, a post office. But the familiar roar of the Pacific filled his ears like a welcome. An old pickup truck sat outside the diner, a faded sign on its door reading Coastal Mission. "Excuse me," Elijah asked the driver, a weathered old man reading a newspaper. "Is this the mission run by Reverend Grayson?" The man looked up, eyeing Elijah's uniform. "Sure is. You looking for the Reverend?" "Yes, sir. I served with him at the camp during the war." The old man nodded slowly. "Well, hop in then. I'm heading back up there now." "Sam, that's Reverend Grayson. He takes in all sorts, wounded soldiers, orphaned kids, folks with nowhere else to go." As the truck bounced up the coastal road, Elijah caught his first glimpse of the ocean, wild and blue, just as he remembered. His heart pounded as they rounded a bend and the old camp came into view. But it wasn't a camp anymore. The barbed wire was gone. The guard towers had been taken down. The buildings remained, but they'd been painted bright colors, blue and yellow and green. A new sign stood where the guard post had been. The Coastal Mission, all are welcome here. In the yard where prisoners had once exercised under armed watch, children now played, a mix of races he wouldn't have believed possible during the war. Japanese, white, black, and Filipino kids chased each other around a swing set. The truck stopped at the main gate. "Here you are, soldier," the driver said. "Sam should be in the main office, that blue building there." Elijah stepped down, thanking the driver. For a moment, he just stood there, taking it all in. The same land, the same buildings, but transformed into something new. With a deep breath, he picked up his duffel bag and walked toward what had once been the camp headquarters, now painted sky blue with white trim. He'd come home, not to Georgia, not to the army, but to the place where he'd learned what it meant to see beyond uniforms and fences. To the place where, against all odds, he'd found something worth crossing an ocean to find again. As he climbed the steps to the mission office, he whispered a prayer of thanks that the journey was finally over, and that perhaps, just perhaps, another journey was about to begin. Elijah limped up the steps of the blue building, his cane tapping against the wooden boards. His heart beat fast in his chest. So much had changed since he'd left this place over a year ago. He knocked on the door, which swung open to reveal a familiar face, older, more lined, but with the same kind eyes. "Reverend Grayson," Elijah said, his voice catching. The chaplain stared for a moment, then broke into a wide smile. "Elijah Brooks! My word, you all the time." Elijah finished with a smile, completing the old church saying. Grayson ushered him inside. The room that had once been Major Archer's severe office was now bright and welcoming, with children's drawings tacked to the walls and a vase of wildflowers on the desk. "Sit down, son, sit down," Grayson urged. "That leg looks like it's giving you trouble." "Shrapnel in France," Elijah explained, easing into a chair. "Better now than it was." "You've come a long way," Grayson said. "All the way from Europe." "Had a promise to keep," Elijah replied simply. Understanding passed between them. Grayson nodded slowly. "You kept the faith, through it all." "Tried my best," Elijah said. He looked around at the transformed space. "What happened here, Reverend?" "Last I knew, this was still a POW camp. After the war ended, the army shut it down," Grayson explained. "They were going to tear everything down, but I had a different idea. Got some backing from the church mission board and a few donors. Turned the place into a home for those who needed one most." "The children outside?" "Orphans, mostly. Some lost parents in the camps. Others are mixed Japanese and American, not welcome many places. Some are children of soldiers who didn't come home." Grayson's eyes grew sad. "War leaves many broken pieces behind." "But you're picking them up," Elijah said. "Putting them back together." "Trying to," Grayson agreed. "The Lord provides. We get by." He studied Elijah's face. "But you didn't come all this way to hear about my mission work, did you?" Elijah looked down at his hands, then back up at the chaplain. "Is she here?" he asked simply. Grayson smiled. "There's someone waiting to see you. But first," he rose and went to a cabinet, unlocking it and removing a small bundle tied with blue ribbon. "These belong to you." Elijah took the bundle, the letters he'd entrusted to Grayson before leaving for Europe, along with new ones he'd never seen. "She wrote to you," Grayson explained. "Through the Red Cross, sent them here, hoping you'd come back someday." With trembling hands, Elijah untied the ribbon. There were at least a dozen letters, each bearing Aiko's neat handwriting. He opened the one on top, dated just after Japan's surrender. "Dear Elijah," he read, "peace has come at last, though at terrible cost. I pray daily that you are safe wherever you are. After release from the camp, I was baptized in the ocean near Crescent Bay. Reverend Grayson performed the ceremony. The water was cold, but my heart was warm with new understanding. I now help tend the graves of fallen soldiers, American and Japanese alike. All were sons of mothers who grieve. All deserve honor in death that some were denied in life." Elijah flipped through the other letters, each telling of her life after the war, her hopes, her work with Grayson at the new mission. The last one caught his eye. "If you ever see the sea again, I'll be there at dusk, among the roses." He looked up at Grayson, who was watching him with gentle eyes. "Where?" Elijah asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "The Shore Cemetery," Grayson replied. "Just down the cliff path. She goes there every evening at sunset." Elijah tucked the letters carefully into his pocket and stood, reaching for his cane. "I should wait until dusk," he said, looking out the window at the afternoon sun. "You've waited long enough, I reckon," Grayson said with a smile. "She's there now. Some days she stays till nightfall." Elijah hesitated. After all this time, what if she's changed her mind? "Son," Grayson placed a hand on his shoulder, "that woman has waited every day for news of you, prayed every morning and night for your safe return. Some things war can't touch." Nodding, Elijah walked to the door. "Thank you, Reverend, for everything." "Don't thank me," Grayson replied. "Just go find her." Outside, Elijah followed the path that wound down the cliff toward the shore, the same path he'd walked on guard duty a lifetime ago. The October sky was clear blue, the sun hanging low over the Pacific, turning the water to gold. His leg ached from the steep path, but Elijah barely noticed. Each step brought him closer to what he'd dreamed of during dark nights in field hospitals and bombed-out villages. As the path leveled out near the shore, a small cemetery came into view. White crosses and stone markers stood in neat rows, facing the sea. Some bore American names, others Japanese characters. And there, kneeling beside a row of graves, was a figure in a simple blue dress, placing wildflowers at the base of each marker. Aiko. Elijah stopped, his heart in his throat. She hadn't seen him yet. Her dark hair, longer now, blew gently in the sea breeze. She looked thinner than he remembered, but her movements had the same grace. He watched as she bowed her head before each grave, lips moving in what might have been prayer. This was what her letter had described, tending the graves of fallen soldiers, honoring the lost. Finally, Elijah found his voice. "Aiko," he called softly. She froze, then slowly rose to her feet. For a moment, she didn't turn, as if afraid the voice might be just her imagination. Then, gradually, she turned toward him. The setting sun caught the tears already falling down her cheeks, turning them to gold. They stared at each other across the small cemetery, neither moving. Then, like awakening from a dream, they both stepped forward. Aiko moved slowly at first, then faster, until she was running across the sandy ground. They met halfway between the graves and the sea. No words, only hands reached out and clasped together. Aiko looked up at his face, taking in the new lines around his eyes, the scar along his jaw that hadn't been there before. Elijah saw the same changes in her, a new seriousness in her gaze, a quiet strength that spoke of hardships endured. Without speaking, they bowed their heads together, hands still joined, in a moment of silent prayer for all that had been lost, and all that, against all odds, had been found again. "I got your letters," Elijah said, when they finally found words again. They sat on a driftwood log near the shore, the cemetery quiet behind them, the ocean roaring softly ahead. "Reverend Grayson kept them safe," Aiko said, her English smoother now, with just a hint of accent. "I wasn't sure they would ever reach you." "They found me," Elijah smiled, "just like I found my way back here." "Your leg," Aiko looked down at his cane. "France," he explained simply. "Shrapnel. Could have been worse." "Many did not come home at all," she said softly. "No, many didn't." Elijah thought of Hayes, dying in the mud, with a request to finish the good fight. "But I made a promise to come back, to finish what we started." Aiko looked out at the ocean. "What did we start, Elijah Brooks? A friendship across fences? A moment of kindness in cruel times? Something worth crossing an ocean to find again," Elijah said. "Something that helped me hold on when everything else was falling apart." The sun dipped lower toward the horizon, painting the sky in colors no artist could capture. In that golden light, Elijah told Aiko about France, about Hayes, about field hospitals and the long journey home. In turn, she told him about the Red Cross Hospital, about helping Japanese families reunite after the camps, about coming back to Crescent Bay to work with Grayson. After what we lived through, she said, helping others heal seemed the only thing that made sense. That sounds about right, Elijah agreed. They fell silent, watching the sun sink into the sea. The first stars appeared overhead, bright points in the darkening sky. What now? Aiko asked finally. You have come back, seen the sea again. Will you return to Georgia? Your family must miss you. I reckon they do, Elijah said. But I was thinking I might stay around here. Reverend Grayson looks like he could use another pair of hands at that mission. Aiko's eyes met his. Hope and caution mingled in her gaze. The world is still not kind to people who cross certain lines. The world's changing, Elijah said. Not fast enough, but changing all the same. And some things are worth standing for, fence or no fence. He reached for her hand, and she didn't pull away. Together they watched the last light fade from the sky. The sound of waves a constant reminder that some things endure while others pass away. I'd like to help with the mission too, Elijah said as they walked back up the cliff path, stars bright overhead. If Reverend Grayson will have me. He will, Aiko said with certainty. He told me once that God doesn't waste anything, not even pain, not even war. It all becomes part of the healing if we let it. Weeks passed, and Elijah settled into life at the coastal mission. The old camp barracks were slowly being transformed into proper dormitories and classrooms. What had once been the guards' quarters now housed staff. Reverend Grayson, 2 teachers from Portland, a doctor who came 3 days a week, and Elijah himself. Aiko lived in town with an elderly Japanese couple who had taken her in after the war. Each morning, she walked up the coastal road to the mission, arriving just as the children were waking. Together, Elijah and Aiko helped Grayson turn the former prison into a home. Elijah's carpentry skills, learned from his grandfather, proved useful in repairing broken windows and leaky roofs. Aiko's gentle way with children helped heal wounds that weren't visible, but ran deep. We need a proper name. Grayson said one evening, as they sat in what had once been the mess hall, now a dining room filled with mismatched chairs and tables. Something that speaks to what this place is becoming. The Silent Lantern Mission, Aiko said quietly. Elijah looked at her. Like the lanterns on Christmas Eve. She nodded. Light in darkness that doesn't shout, but simply is. The Silent Lantern, Grayson repeated, nodding. I like it. The first real test came when local townspeople realized what was happening at the old camp. Some were supportive, bringing donations of clothes and food. Others were less welcoming. You're bringing enemy kids right into our backyard, complained Mr. Turner, who owned the hardware store. After what they did at Pearl Harbor? Children aren't enemies, Grayson replied calmly. They're just children. The tension grew when rumors spread about Elijah and Aiko, the black soldier and the Japanese nurse who worked side by side at the mission. Some memories of Christmas Eve 1944 still lingered, passed down in whispered stories. Ain't natural, someone wrote on a sign planted at the mission entrance. Mixing races, mixing enemies with Americans. Elijah pulled the sign down before the children could see it. Some folks never learn, he sighed. Some just need time, Aiko replied, and examples they can't ignore. She was right. Slowly, as the mission took in more children, orphans from the war, unwanted mixed-race babies, kids whose parents couldn't feed them, even the hardest hearts in town began to soften. It was hard not to be moved by the sight of children playing on swings where guard towers had once stood, or learning letters in classrooms that had been prison cells. The turning point came when the first group of new orphans arrived from a Portland orphanage that had closed. 12 children, ages 4 to 10, with nowhere else to go. We don't have enough beds yet, Grayson worried, and food's going to be tight. That Sunday, Elijah stood beside the Reverend in the small chapel that had once been his refuge during the war. The room was crowded with children and a few curious townspeople. "Friends," Elijah said, nervous but determined. "Many of you know me as the soldier who guarded this camp during the war. Now I'm asking for your help to turn what was a place of captivity into a place of freedom." He spoke of the children who needed homes, of the chance to heal old wounds, of the opportunity to show the world that mercy was stronger than hate. "My grandmother had a saying," he finished. "You can't change yesterday, but you sure can change tomorrow. These kids are tomorrow. Will you help us give them one worth having?" To everyone's surprise, Mr. Turner from the hardware store was the first to stand up. "My boy died at Iwo Jima," he said gruffly. "Never thought I'd say this, but he'd want these kids to have a chance. I'm bringing lumber tomorrow. We'll build those beds." Others followed, offers of food, clothing, time, skills. By evening, the Silent Lantern mission had more help than it knew what to do with. Later, as Elijah walked Aiko back to town in the twilight, she smiled up at him. "You have a preacher's heart after all," she said. "You spoke, and they listened." "They were ready to listen," Elijah replied. "Hearts change when they're good and ready, not a minute before." In the soft evening light, with the mission taking shape behind them and the future opening before them, Elijah took Aiko's hand. No fences separated them now. No war raged around them. Just the constant sound of the sea and the hope of work worth doing together. A year passed, then another. The Silent Lantern mission grew, adding new buildings and more children. What had begun as a desperate refuge became a thriving community. By December 1947, the mission housed 30 children and a staff of 8. The old camp was barely recognizable. Freshly painted buildings surrounded by garden plots, a playground, and even a small orchard started from saplings. As Christmas approached, excitement filled the air. For many of the children, it would be their first real Christmas celebration. "We need to make it special," Elijah told Aiko as they strung paper chains in the dining hall. "Something they'll remember all their lives." "Like our Christmas Eve?" Aiko asked with a small smile. "Well, maybe not exactly like that," Elijah laughed, remembering the forbidden kiss through the fence. "But just as meaningful." The whole town got involved this time. The hardware store donated wood for a massive Christmas tree. The ladies' sewing circle made stockings for each child. Fishermen brought in extra catch for the Christmas feast. On Christmas Eve, the mission glowed with lanterns, paper ones made by the children under Aiko's guidance. They lined the paths, hung from porch railings, and filled the windows with warm light. The chapel, once a simple room with wooden benches, now had proper pews and a small altar. It was packed that night as townspeople joined the mission residents for the service. Elijah, wearing his one good suit, stood before them. After 2 years of study with Reverend Grayson, he had finally become what he'd always dreamed of being, a preacher in his own right. "Friends," he began, his deep voice filling the room, "tonight we celebrate more than the birth of a child in Bethlehem. We celebrate rebirth of this place, of our community, of hearts once hardened by war and fear." He spoke of forgiveness, of second chances, of the light that comes after darkness. As he spoke, his eyes found Aiko, sitting at the small harmonium in the corner. She had taught herself to play over the past year, adding music to their services. "True peace," Elijah concluded, "isn't just the absence of war. It's the presence of justice, of mercy, of love that sees beyond differences to the heart God placed in each of us." After the sermon, Aiko played while the children's choir sang carols they had practiced for weeks. Then came the moment they had all been waiting for, the lighting of the lanterns. Elijah and Aiko stepped forward, each holding a single candle. Together, they lit the first lantern, placed on a table at the front of the chapel. "This light," Elijah said, "is for peace." One by one, people came forward to light their own lanterns from the first, each dedicating the light to something or someone: hope, lost loved ones, new beginnings, forgiveness. The brightest carols followed, joy to the world, hark the herald angels sing, and finally, Silent Night, sung softly as snow began to fall outside, visible through the chapel windows. As the last notes faded, Aiko leaned close to Elijah and whispered, "The whole camp is silent again, but this time in peace." He nodded, his heart too full for words. Where there had once been guards and prisoners, fences and fear, now stood a community bound by something stronger than any war could break. Later that night, after the children were asleep dreaming of morning surprises, Elijah walked Aiko to the porch of her small cottage at the edge of the mission grounds. She had moved there earlier that year, when Mr. and Mrs. Tanaka, the elderly couple she had lived with, passed away within months of each other. Snow fell softly around them, catching in Aiko's dark hair and on Elijah's shoulders. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket. "Been saving up for it." He pulled out a small box, wrapped in simple brown paper. Aiko opened it carefully to find a silver locket inside. "Oh, Elijah," she breathed. "It's beautiful. Open it," he urged. Inside was a tiny pressed rose petal, faded but still recognizable. Beneath it, engraved in the silver, were the words, "What connects us is stronger." "From your letter," Aiko whispered, looking up at him with shining eyes. "You kept it all this time?" "Carried it through France and back," Elijah nodded. "Reminded me what I was fighting for." As snowflakes danced around them, Elijah took both her hands in his. "Aiko Tanaka," he said, his voice steady despite his pounding heart. "I crossed an ocean to find you again. I'm asking if you'll walk beside me for whatever road comes next." "Are you asking me to marry you, Elijah Brooks?" Aiko's voice was soft but certain. "Yes, ma'am, I reckon I am." Her answer came not in words, but in a kiss. No fence between them this time, no war raging around them. Just the soft falling snow and the promise of a future neither could have imagined in the dark days of 1944. Late 1950s, the Silent Lantern mission had grown into a respected institution along the Oregon coast. What began with a handful of war orphans now included a proper school, a medical clinic, and housing for both children and the elderly who needed care. Elijah and Aiko Brooks walked hand in hand through the rose garden that bloomed where guard posts had once stood. At 50, Elijah's hair was touched with gray at the temples, and he still walked with a slight limp. Aiko, approaching 45, had laugh lines around her eyes, but moved with the same graceful energy she always had. Around them, children of every color played together on the wide lawn, the latest generation to find home at the mission. Some were orphans, others from troubled homes. A few the children of former mission residents who had grown up and started families of their own. "Pastor Brooks," called a young boy, running up to Elijah. "Teacher says to tell you the reporter is here." "Thank you, Danny," Elijah smiled, ruffling the boy's hair. "Tell her we'll be right along." The reporter from the Portland newspaper waited in what had once been the camp commander's office, now Elijah's study. She was young, eager, notebook already open on her lap. "Thank you for agreeing to the interview," she said as Elijah and Aiko entered. "The Silent Lantern mission has quite a reputation. I'm hoping to capture its history for our Sunday feature." "Happy to help," Elijah said, settling into his chair. "Where would you like to start? I understand this place was once a POW camp during the war," the reporter asked. "That must have been a difficult transformation." "The buildings were the easy part," Aiko said. "Hearts were harder." "I've heard rumors," the reporter said carefully, "about how you two met. Something about a Christmas Eve during the war?" Elijah and Aiko exchanged a glance, a lifetime of understanding passing between them. "There are many stories about this place," Elijah said. "Some true, some grown in the telling. What matters isn't who fought whom," Aiko added, "but who forgave." The reporter looked between them, sensing there was more to the story than they were saying. "And the mission's name?" The silent lantern, what does that mean? That light doesn't always come with thunder and lightning, Elijah explained. Sometimes it's just a small flame, passed from one hand to another, that changes everything. As the interview continued, children's laughter drifted through the open window. Outside, life went on, lessons being taught, gardens tended, meals prepared. The work of building something that would last. Later, after the reporter had left with her notes and photographs, Elijah and Aiko stood before the mission sign, a carved wooden plaque bearing the words, "The Silent Lantern Mission, where mercy broke the wire, founded 1946. "Do you ever wonder," Aiko asked softly, "how different things might have been if you hadn't found me in that storm?" "Every day," Elijah nodded. "And every day I thank God you were too stubborn to stay inside where it was dry." She laughed, the sound still musical after all these years. "And you were too kind to follow rules that made no sense." The sun began to set over the Pacific, painting the sky in colors that never grew old, no matter how many times they watched it. Seagulls wheeled overhead, their calls mixing with the eternal sound of waves against the shore. From the chapel came the sound of singing, children practicing hymns for Sunday service. The same chapel where Elijah had once sought refuge from loneliness, where he and Aiko had exchanged vows, where countless children had found hope when the world had forgotten them. "Come on, Mrs. Brooks," Elijah said, offering his arm. "Time to round up the little ones for supper." Arm in arm, they walked back toward the mission buildings, no longer a prison camp, no longer divided by fences and war, but a home built on the foundation of a single act of mercy on a stormy night long ago. Behind them, the mission sign caught the last rays of the setting sun, the words glowing golden in the fading light. "Where mercy broke the wire." A promise kept, a good fight finished, and peace at last, where silence had once meant fear, but now meant something altogether different. The quiet miracle of healing, of home, of love that had crossed every barrier placed before it, and emerged stronger on the other side.